But, we continue to move forward. We continue to progress. And as, our factories get bigger and the cities grow around them, this continues to change what sex and marriage and love, what it looks like in society. So as we go into the 1900s, this time period is marked by industrialization, it's marked by urbanization. I've already mentioned the growth of cities, and it's marked by the commercialization of leisure, because that's the other thing. As people move into these cities and they are no longer on the family farm, and they go to work, but they don't spend all day working, because that also is distinct from farm life, where you would work from sun up to sundown. Now with wage labor, even though the laws that have like a maximum work day or work week haven't been put in place yet, nevertheless, you don't work the entire day. So now you get off and you have this money, and it's like, and you're in the city. So what are you going to do? So your book talks about how all of these kind of amusements evolve, right? Everything from clubs, to bars, to, parks, to, fairs. So, and of course, these things cost money. And what goes along with this is that, as you now have these fun things to do and you have money to do them, then the question becomes, who are you going to do them with? And so it is during this time period in the cities that the former courtship method of calling is replaced by this new courtship method, which is called dating. So I'm going to come back to this slide, but I'm going to talk about the distinction between the dating system and the courtship system. So the courtship system was the predominant, kind of premarital process by which you interact with potential marriage partners during the 19th century. And sometimes this system is also called calling. And that's because, what it involved would be that you would call upon, if you were the man, you would call upon the woman that you're interested in her home. And this meant that, you had to have her family's permission and kind of larger kind of, family, approval. Usually both families had to approve. And you would call upon her in her home under the watchful or, the near eye of family members. And so, that's what calling looked like. But with the rise of the cities and wage labor, what we get in the start of the 20th century is the dating system. And this is also sometimes called the treating system. So in the dating system, now, of course, you are, you're going out, right? You are picking up your date and then you are going somewhere. So let's just kind of compare some particular points between these two. So one major difference between dating and courtship is that dating at this time in particular involved multiple overlapping relationships without the expectation of long-term commitment. So you could date multiple people at a time, that it was not seen as being nearly as serious, and the expectation of commitment or monogamy wasn't there the way that it was with calling. Another kind of significant difference is, under the courtship system, like I said, it was more of a public decision because, it usually involved her parents, his parents, I don't know, all the church goers, church folk and town folk, would be weighing in. But, it was less private. Even though it took place in a private setting, it took place in a home. Dating was a more private matter between two individuals, right? Usually it just involved you deciding to ask someone to go out. And this private decision, however, this private interaction, it took place in a public setting, a restaurant, a movie, or theater. And unlike courtship, dating involves spending money and participating in that consumer, commodified society and culture. And this is where the term treating comes from, because oftentimes, this was a gendered act. Men treated their female dates. And the reason why it was established this way is because at this time period, first of all, young men were much more likely to be working for a wage than young women were. And even of the young women who were working, because there have always been working class, working poor women who have been part of the labor force. If you think there's a gender gap today, well, there was a real gender gap back then. So, it was the sense that, it was his treat, largely because he could afford it, and she could not. And so that's kind of the other kind of significant difference between the calling and the treating system. And your textbook does note this, that this was a shift in power. Women had more power under the calling system. They, they had some ability to welcome or not welcome someone into their home and into their personal space, because no money was being spent. They had a lot more control over, to what extent they had to be gracious or show interest. But the treating system, men had more power. Because they oftentimes had more money, they were the ones who had to initiate the ask. And then because they were spending their money, and they were usually able to, make decisions regarding, what the date involved. And then, of course, women, because they were kind of the subordinate in those interactions, they had a lot less power about, how to act or how gracious or not gracious, they needed to be on this date that they weren't paying for. And so it's worth noting that this new system, dating, was rapidly accepted, particularly by the middle class, as early as the first half of the 20th century. And, and it remained very popular until around 1965. And that's when I think, thinking about the sexual revolution, and, some of what we've discussed in our chapter related to sexuality, the kind of expectations around even, going on a date, and as a way of showing interest or a way of initiating kind of sexual, the possibility of sexual intimacy. It became less necessary as we started to see, with the sexual revolution, the beginning groundworks of what then escalated in the next 20, 30 years, which was, of course, the rise of hookup culture. So all of this, of course, as we're just going through this historical timeline, what I most want you to really, just start thinking about is how all of this is socially constructed, that what's acceptable, 50 today, was not acceptable 50 years ago, and what was acceptable then wasn't necessarily acceptable, 50 years before that, right? That none of this is necessarily stable or inherent or natural, right? All of it's socially constructed and therefore in flux. So what else is unique about this time period? Well, as you are now women no longer in kind of the powerful position, and you're having to wait to be asked on these dates and to be treated, what we see is the beginning of the pressure to be sexy. In fact, the new definition of that word appears in 1923. Before that, the word sexy really just kind of meant associated with sex. Like it was just kind of a adjective form of sex. But, now, when we think about what sexy means now, that definition comes out of the 1920s. And so along with that pressure to be sexy and that the pressure to have a man ask you on a date, treat you to a date, there start to be these aesthetic demands on women's bodies in the same way that we see now. The rise of beauty culture, the importance of diets, because the body, the ideal body that comes out in the 1920s is unique, because for the first time instead of the ideal body being this fuller figured, curvaceous, heavier kind of body build. Now, think about, all the images that you've seen of flappers. Instead now there is this emphasis on being slender and thin, almost to the point of androgynous. And so in order to achieve that body, women oftentimes had to diet. And we also see the rise of the makeup industries. Some of the big companies that still exist today, they got their start, during this time period. For instance, Maybelline. If you're like me, at some point maybe in your life, you've owned some Maybelline mascara, and maybe you didn't know that that company is as old as it was. And even back then, apparently, mascara, or what they called eyelash beautifier, was a thing. So, what are the positives about this time period when sex, really for the first time for both men and women starts to be, released from these, Puritan constraints, and it starts to become fun? Well, the positive is, it does represent increased freedom. There are more gender egalitarian relationships, as young men and young women start working together outside of the home. That's more true for like working class, working poor men and women. The development of cities allowed for queer communities to emerge. And so that was a kind of important kind of trend that comes out of this time, but there are negatives as well. So the fact is there's still limited access to birth control, and that meant the rise in premarital births. And this is the time period where we start to see a real increase in single motherhood, because unlike before, there is less community pressure to do the right thing. Not as many shotgun, weddings are taking place, because parents in the community no longer have that level of social control in these larger cities as they did in small towns. So you have more people having sex, outside of the constraints of marriage, but it was risky. And even though, and there was still stigma, not necessarily in having the sex, but certainly if you wind up pregnant and unmarried, there was a stigma to that at that time period, because, then there's the proof that you're having this premarital sex. Oh, I'm still going backwards. So then we'll skip over the late 20s and 30s. That's just sad Depression era America. And no major shifts in regards to our definitions surrounding love, marriage, and sex going on then. So we're now going to move forward into the 1940s and 1950s. And this is where we first start to see the replacement in a lot of couples of the patriarchal property marriage with this newfangled type of marriage called the Breadwinners Housewife marriage. And so there are a lot of contributing factors. So Breadwinner's Housewife marriage is this marriage that's built around the idea of separate spheres, that there's this public sphere that's inhabited by men, and with a focus on production, they're making money, and they're making the type of money that can support a family, because during this time period, especially, post World War II, you have the push for what's called a family wage, because the government was invested in the idea of women getting out of the job force and getting back in the home. And in order to make that happen, of course, they had to make it so that families could afford to live on one wage. And then in some countries, your book notes that these policies were weaker in the U.S. than most of Europe. There are also these breadwinner policies. And so these breadwinner policies, that were fought for by the unions, these were policies that in some cases, paid, compensated women for staying at home and raising their children. And some of these policies, were more focused on pushing women out of the labor force and replacing them with men. Which is more the type of policies that were passed in America, more so than the policies where, they were paying women to stay at home and raise children. But all of this led to the creation of separate spheres. So in the public sphere, you have men and they're focused on production. And in the private sphere, which is the sphere that's inhabited by women, the focus is on reproduction. And there is this whole kind of ideology referred to as the Code of Domesticity, which really kind of elevated this idea of women being, super invested in the private sphere, right? In the beautification of their homes, of making, elaborate meals for their husband, prioritizing, this idea of, of taking care of him, of taking care of all of his needs in the private sphere, of focusing on children. And at this point, of course, now very few people are living on farms. So families have gotten smaller comparative to, before, although they're pretty big families compared to, the 10, 20 years that preceded this, because people weren't having a lot of children during the Great Depression. And so, that focus on raising your children and spending more time, and that to be, a good mother is to really be invested in your children. All of this comes out of this time period. What also contributes to, this time period, as I discussed, is, the fact that it is the baby boom. But then also after World War II, we have this push for suburbanization as opposed to urbanization. So baby boom is just, this is the time period that happens, at the end of World War II and the decade or so that follows it. And you have the children that are born during those years. There are much more of them than, like I said, the decade or two that preceded it. And then there are also more children born during this time period than the decade that come after. So people are having these large families because, first of all, it's seen as being their patriotic duty. Children are healthier, so there's a decrease in infant mortality. The Salk and polio vaccine are discovered and are disseminated during this time period. So you have healthier children, and then of course for America, at least after World War II, we kind of are in this kind of financial boom, this golden period. So people are like, it's a great time to have as many kids as we can afford. And with, the government pushing family wage and breadwinner policies, people are like, hey, we can afford to have a lot of children. And so then what are you going to do with all these children? Well, raising them in cramped apartments in the city is now no longer appealing. So we have the development of the suburbs. And so these are the areas that were before rural, but now they are building homes, single family homes, as opposed to, apartment buildings that have multiple families living in them. You have these single family homes, and they are, they're being built outside of the city. And the federal government plays a huge role here because, they offer long-term mortgages at low rates to qualified buyers, particularly for veterans. The Veterans Administration, the VA, they offer even lower rates for XGIs. And then this is also where we start to see a big push for highway construction that, connected the suburbs to the city, because for the most part, the husbands who are going off to their public sphere to work their jobs where they get paid a wage labor, those jobs are in the city, but their wives are staying at home. And to give you an idea, and just imagine, at this time period, if you have never, only have lived in apartments, right? You now have this home in these large tracts with all these other homes that look like yours, and you're able to pick your floor plan and your furnishings, and you decorate it. And this is partly what the Code of Domesticity was about. It was about, this idea that, that this is where women should focus all their energy and efforts. Now, it is just worth noting that the suburbs weren't open to all. First of all, there were restrictive covenants that in some cases expressly prohibited selling these homes to people of color, oftentimes African Americans, but there were restrictive covenants that also sometimes limited the sale of homes to Latinos and Asian Americans as well. And then even if there weren't restrictive covenants, there were oftentimes, real estate practices like racial steering, where you basically would steer people, steer minorities to minority neighborhoods, as opposed to steering them to, any home that they can afford. But instead, you would steer them towards homes that were in the side of town, which was dominated by minorities. And then there were bank practices like redlining, which made it hard, or impossible to get a good loan in an area that the bank designated as unsavory to lend to. And they would denote those places on a map by using red marker. That's why we call it redlining. Unsurprisingly, a lot of those places were places that had a high concentration of racial minorities. And so you didn't find a lot of racial minorities in places like Levittown, which, was the brainchild of William Levitt. It was one of our first big suburban communities, and give you a video if you want to kind of get a better sense of what those early suburbs look like. So, you have your women, they're staying at home. And the men are going off to work, and they're kind of focused on their lives in the suburbs. And what's really interesting, and of course, is all of this is happening after women had just been in the labor market in greater numbers than they had ever been before, because of course women were told it was their patriotic duty to participate in the labor force during wartime, and they were actively recruited. I mean, that is where the Rosie the Riveter, that imagery that we all represent, that we all I said represent, and that is not the word that I wanted to use, but I'm blanking on the word I want to recognize. There we go. That we all recognize, that was a recruitment poster. That was wartime propaganda meant to encourage women to enter the labor force. But once the war was over and men came home, there was also then an active counter campaign to then push them back into the home, to push them back into the private sphere as opposed to the public sphere. And they did that by discrimination in hiring and promotion practices. They did that by, the Breadwinner Policies, that would resulted in women either not making nearly as much as their male counterparts or just losing their jobs to men applicants altogether. So, with limited opportunities in the public sphere, women were, whether by choice or by force, they were pushed back into the private sphere. And so what we see during the 1950s is what your book describes as the concerted entrenchment of the nuclear family, of that breadwinner, homemaker, traditional family model. But that wasn't the only reason why the 50s are a standout in terms of being unusual. There is a great book about this by Stephanie Kuntz. It's called The Way We Never Were. I've used it in past classes when I teach family. But, we think about, the 50s and the early 60s, before the revolutions began, think about like those old black and white TV shows, and people talk about this as being like the golden era, and they speak about the way it used to be. But what's truly, and this just shows you how faulty human memory can be, is, if you look at the history of marriage and the history of families in America, that model, first of all, was not true for everyone, but even for the people that it was true for, people who were white and largely middle class, it was for such a relatively short period of time. You're talking about a decade and a half. That kind of idealized breadwinner homemaker model was really in place, but yet we call upon that model all the time. We meaning society, not we meaning me or perhaps even you, but we call upon that model all the time, to talk about how the family has changed so much since then. But the 50s really were a unique time period, and your book gives you several examples as to why. So one way in which the 50s were unusually conservative, let's look at how homosexuality was treated during this time. Not that at any time period in history in America, there's been like this high level of acceptance and tolerance of homosexuality and same-sex relations, but there was some level of acceptance in the 1920s. And they note particularly with women, where there was like this well-known concept of smashing, where it was considered, perfectly acceptable for women to have like these crushes and these kind of intense intimate friendships with other women. And although, your book notes it wasn't explicitly discussed, to what extent were some of these super intimate friendships, also sexually intimate. Certainly there is correspondence and there is media that suggests that there was some awareness that, for some of these friendships, sexual intimacy was a part of them. And then, even like thinking about World War II, during this time period, the first gay bars opened in 1940. The first advocacy organization was founded in 1951. These were largely for men. Gay women at this time were just less visible. And your book kind of links that to just how, in general, women were just still kind of desexualized. There was still that good girl, bad girl, Madonna whore dichotomy, where really no one was thinking about women having sex for anything besides reproduction purposes. And so the idea that women could be having lesbian sex was just, mind-blowing, boggling. No one thought about it, except for perhaps the women that were living those lives. And, your book makes a very interesting point about, to what extent does World War II play during, does it play in kind of promoting this kind of increased awareness around homosexuality. And they talk about, it has a lot to do with the fact that you have lots of men and women expending prolonged periods of time away from each other, largely in the company of members of their same sex. And in the case of men, soldiers, in situations that are dangerous and threatening, but to the extent that this probably encouraged people to kind of consider and act upon same-sex desire is not beyond the realm of possibility. It makes in a lot of ways sense. But then shortly thereafter, there was this crackdown on it, because we start to see in the 1950s defining homosexual as a person as opposed to an act. Don't know why I put two S's in person. I promise I can spell, but I apparently can't type. But, before this, of course, same-sex sexual activity, there was awareness of that, and there were terms for some of those activities, but we didn't start to actually kind of conceptualize and identify people on the basis of those activities until 1950. And kind of the result of us doing that, of identifying people, on the basis of their sexual activities, means that it set society up to engage in this kind of conservative backlash, because now the backlash was against people, not even against like an act itself. And so your book talks about, laws were passed, Individuals experience discrimination in a variety of spheres, everything from, their ability to rent apartments, to get and keep jobs, their abilities to enjoy kind of public accommodations and settings like bars and restaurants and clubs. McCarthyism, which of course we associate Joseph McCarthy with his obsession with communists, but there also was a real focus on locating and outing and punishing people who were believed to be homosexual as well. And so, your book notes that the politics of the 1950s were unique. They were unusually family focused, they were conformist, they were pro-censorship and gender policing. So what happens if you're young and single during this time period? What is that like? Well, one thing that, the shift that we see in dating and marriage during this time period reflects the realities of, after 2 world wars and a depression, there was a bit of a male shortage, and particularly, a shortage of eligible, financially stable, non-traumatized by war men. And so instead of this kind of the original kind of conception of dating where, both men and women are, dating multiple people, there isn't that expectation of commitment, dating starts to take the form of what's called going steady. Where, as opposed to you dating multiple people, dating now serves as a kind of precursor to marriage. It's kind of a pre-commitment commitment. And for, women in particular, that's because going steady was seen as social security, right? You lock your man down, you lock him down early so you don't end up in an old maid. Because with a shortage of men, of eligible suitors, there's a real possibility of that. And at this time period, and hell, to a certain extent, even in today's time period, there's still this stigma around being a woman who isn't not married. Now we'll talk about maybe why would men, because if there's a male shortage, then that means that there is a woman surplus. So why are heterosexual men going along with going steady? We'll talk about that in a second, because it's related to this next question. How did adults respond? Believe it or not, adults were not supportive of their teenagers engaging in going steady. They felt like there was real dangers to becoming emotionally so invested in someone, in one particular person. And that's because that emotional investments aligned with increased physical and sexual investment in one person as well. And that perhaps sheds some light on why men were agreeing to go steady, because, going out on dates with multiple people, and especially in a society where the sexual double standard is alive and well, most women are not going to go but so far sexually on, with those non-committed dates. But now going steady, it was seen as being kind of a commitment, a pre-commitment to being married. It was its own form of monogamy. Women were engaging in premarital sex. If not premarital sex, certainly they were engaging in, sexual activities, not including vaginal intercourse, in much higher numbers than they were before this kind of dating model existed and became dominant. And so, if you're a man, it's like, okay, well, I can go steady and I can have sex with this girl who, for all intents and purposes, because the idea is she's only having sex with you and is committed and you're supposed to get married one day, she's still seen as a good girl. So it is the thrill of having sexual intercourse with someone who is on the right side of that good girl, bad girl dichotomy. And so, people might think that that's pretty interesting, maybe even ironic, that during this decade known for its conservatism, that, premarital sexual experimentation increased in this decade. Another factor that kind of led to this increase in premarital sexual experimentation is the role of the automobile. They're now a lot more available to a lot more of the population, including young people. And if you'd use this automobile to take your steady out on dates, and then after the date, in your automobile kind of served as a room with wheels. So a lot of sexual experimentation was happening in the back seats of automobiles all around the country during this supposedly conservative time period.